Auf'm Weg steht a Bäum, steht eingebeugen. Alle Vögel von dem Bäum seinen sich zerfleugen. 3 kein Misrach, 3 kein Meirev und der Rest kein Durem. Und dem Bäum gelost allein, heftig fahr dem Sturm. Sog ihr zu der Mammen her, soll's mir noch nicht sterben, wenn ich Mama eins und 2 bald a Vogel werden. Ich will sitzen auf dem Bäum und will ihm verwiegen, über Winter mit a Trist, mit a schönem Nigen. Yam tari 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 tam. Yam tari 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 tam. So die Mame mit dem Kind und sie weint mit Tränen. West Cholile auf'm Bäum mir verfreuen werden. Sag ich, Mama, sie ist a Schott, deine schöne Augen. Und jeder was und jeder wenn, bin ich mir a Vogel. Wenn die Mama itzig reun, seh Gottes Willen, nimm sich mit a Schalikel, kenn sich noch verkillen. Die Kaloschen tu sich an, es geht a scharfer Winter. Und die Kutschmen nehm euch mit, weis mir und wind mir.
Welcome to Extra Sauce. So this is part 2 of my conversation with Yehudah DovBer Zirkind. Something that really struck me in part 1 is how Yehudah put it so poetically that we have both roots and wings, and that we need both of those, and that it's important to resist the urge to clip our wings in an effort to stay close to our roots, and also resist the urge to cut off our roots in an effort to fly, and that we really don't need to be swapping one for the other, that if we're being true to ourselves and we want to live a life as seekers, which is a lifelong process, that we learn to find a balance of both of those. So I chose a beautiful song for the introduction here that really speaks to that. It's the poem by Itzik Manger, Auf'm Weg steht a Bäum. And it tells the story of a little bird whose only wish is to fly and conquer the world in his own little way. But his mother, in all her love, keeps protecting him and putting on coats and sweaters and boots, and eventually becomes too heavy and he can't fly. And the song I'll end with is a beautiful song. It was composed some 10 years ago, actually in honor of the students that were murdered in Merkaz Harav Yeshiva, and is words from Harav Kook. Really beautiful words, and it is encouraging the individual to fly and fly high, because we are endowed with wings, and strong wings, wings of an eagle. And yeah, so that's the story. Roots and wings. And as Yehudah DovBer puts it at the end there, that is the journey of those who are Mavakshe Derech, people who are seeking a path rather than settling for just walking away from one. And so that's the deal. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to hear some feedback from you, and talk to you soon.
There's actually a beautiful story that I like to tell in connection with the issue that you raised of suppressed or repressed sexuality within the religious world and in general. The story is attributed to the Divrei Chaim. I heard the name of the great Rav Chaim Sanzer, the Rav of Tzanz, the Divrei Chaim, the great Chassidic master. And the story goes that once somebody comes to him, and I'll say it in Yiddish just because I can't control myself. He said, Rebbe, mein Sinn ist Meshiga. Tanzt mit Schicksals und esst Chaser. Der Rebbe hat ihm geantwortet, sagt, wo dein Sohn getanzt mit dem Chaser und gegessen die Schicksals, wollte gewinnen Meshuga. Dein Sohn ist normal. Alamai ist ein Balteive, ist ein sündiger Mensch. Aber ist nicht Meshuga. I'll translate it into English. Somebody came to Divrei Chaim and said, my son is crazy. Why? Because he dances with schicksals and he eats pork. So Divrei Chaim answers and says, if your son would have danced with the chazer and eaten the schicksals, then he would be crazy. Your son is not crazy. He's healthy. He's just lustful. He's a person with desires. So maybe he is sinning against the laws of the Torah, but he's not crazy. I think the problem is, in the religious community, that they need to go back to basics in terms of what the Gemara, Chazal, and the Rambam also say, that a person should not say, efshi bevosar chazer, that I cannot tolerate or I find swine meat disgusting, or sexual intercourse disgusting. Rather, someone should say that I want it, but what should I do that my Father in heaven says that I cannot indulge in such a type? I think it would be a lot more healthier if there would be a recognition and explicit education on the part of the mechanchim, the educators, in the Chassidic community, in the Frum community, saying masturbation is normal, sexual fantasies are normal, sexual desires are totally normal. There's nothing wrong about you, there's nothing subhuman about you, nothing animalistic about you, or terribly wrong with you for having all these urges. We as Jews have a mandate of Kedusha. The mandate of Kedusha means that sometimes we need to sublimate our desires. Again, it can be very, very problematic. I myself struggle very, very deeply with how to live up to the mandate of Kedusha when there is ever-increasing pressures of the flesh. I'll be very, very frank. It is not something that you can easily reconcile. However, I think the educational system will go a very, very long way. Instead of erecting sorry for the pun, a veil or a shroud of secrecy, again using feminine and masculine talk around this concept of sexuality and building up this huge elephant in the room of the forbidden masturbation and desires and all that, they should just be frank and honest and say, this is what occurs, what you're going to go through is normal. If you do an Aveira, if you're Nichshal, which join the club. And actually the Rebbe did not focus so much on this issue because it was understood that in these generations we need to worry more about basic Yiddishkeit than correcting the oven, the sin of all that. So I think here is the problem, that on a certain level I don't think the religious system can really do much, because if according to halacha, at least normative halacha, the way most people understand, any kind of non-marital sex is prohibited and masturbation is prohibited. I'm not talking about outlying opinions or minority opinions or more learned, meaning more complicated opinions, which will say that maybe masturbation isn't as problematic, or that maybe if you're in a monogamous relationship, let's say you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, some people want to invoke the lumdus about Pilegesh. I'm not even talking about arguments that are used in more liberal Orthodox communities or liberal communities in general. I'm saying if we stick to the more Haredi, halachic, normative system where masturbation is usur on the books and any kind of non-marital sex is prohibited, then at least, the least that you can do, not the most, the least you can do is to normalize the sexual feeling. the minute you make a person feel perverted, and that is the essence of the story of the Divrei Chaim. You're not perverted for having a type of a chazer. You might be engaging in something which is prohibited, but it isn't a perversion. The problem is when something that is non-normative, i.e. non-halachically permissible, when you deviate from it, you're seen as perverted, as seen as an aberration, as an anomaly, that there's something wrong with you. No, there's nothing wrong with you. It is a very, very high challenge, especially in today's generation of sexual promiscuity, where people regularly, non-religious people or people that are non-halachic, regularly engaged in non-marital sex. It's one of, I think, the extreme challenges of our generation. And I say people, I don't think many people are going to go fry for not wanting to eat, for wanting to eat pork, but I think there are people that are going to be severely challenged in their Yiddishkeit when it comes to sexuality. And even there, I can tell people, listen, if that is the one area where you're going to be nichshal, it doesn't mean that it is an all or nothing phenomenon. If you say, listen, I need to be in a relationship, first of all, speak to your Rav. The Rav could tell you that maybe if you go to a mikveh, while it might not be recommended, maybe it is halacha, the ein moirin came. The rabbi is not going to be able to dispense a heter and say, you can indulge in sex with your girlfriend if she keeps taras hamishpacha and goes to the mikveh if you're not married. But nevertheless, if you're in a situation where you're desperate and there's no way out, you need to think. You need to better talk to a rabbi and ask them what might be what is the lesser of the two evils, as it were. That is A. But also I think the general normalization of this of sexuality and not hiding the secrecy, the shame, that is something which is unacceptable in today's day and age. And I remember growing up, we were not taught about it. It was always the parents and rebbes were ashamed. They giggled. They knew that we knew. I knew from Svarim about all these things. And yet when we confronted them, it was very embarrassing. I understand. So maybe certain people maybe a regular parent or teacher, especially in Haredi community, shouldn't be the conduits of information. Maybe there should be a special Haredi sex ed teacher. Maybe there should be a designated person that you don't really interact with on a daily level. Maybe a regular Rebbe would be too embarrassed to talk about these things, perhaps. But I think that there must be a lot more sexual awareness, and just because it is prohibited does not mean that there's an excuse not to talk about it. That isn't that thing. Then briefly, let me just briefly touch on the other issues. I know it's very late. Now, there was one issue that you talked about, the pain of the Rebbe of calling somebody as full of mitzvahs as a Peshay Yisrael. I think that's very beautiful. I think that's one of the redeeming features of Lubavitch, the Avos Yisrael, the true love for Yidden and seeing them as a chelik alekami mal mamash. And I only agree with that. I only feel that is something which is inherently beautiful, as opposed to other communities which might shun other Jews and calling them shkatzim or goyim, or even for not living up to them. I think the Perek Lamed Beis of Tanya, the Leiv of Tanya, the heart of Tanya, which is about the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael, and the Alter Rebbe says a very strong line that the main thing is to be Mekarev a Yid, and maybe maybe through being Mekarev, being kind to another Jew, you can be Mekarev, and even if not, you have not lost the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. I think that is a paradigm shift. I mean, that is a game-changing idea within Judaism, and I think Lubavitch are great exemplars of it. Again, not that everything, from my point of view, everything is perfect with the Lubavitch derech. I think there is a lot that has to be improved. Again, I don't consider, just for the record, I don't define myself as Lubavitcher today. I'm very close to Lubavitch, but I reached a point where I feel that my hashkafa is no longer Lubavitch hashkafa, and my lifestyle is no longer Lubavitch. I don't feel I have the right to call myself Lubavitch. I have a personal disdain for what is known as Lubavitch Light or Lubavitch Zero, like Coca-Cola Zero. I think it's hypocritical. But I know that certain people do live that way, and I'm not there to judge them. I'm saying for myself, I think it would be hypocritical to call myself Lubavitch Light when I'm not. I don't presently think in my hashkafic outlook the same way as what I was taught as the normative Lubavitch hashkafas. I say I don't subscribe to the worldview anymore. But I do feel that the issue of Ahavas Yisrael is one of the great things that I learned from Lubavitch. That briefly. Now, the other issue that you mentioned about subjective versus objective questions is right on the money. Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. That anybody who's going to tell you that their connection to Yiddishkeit or to life is based on a computer algorithm of zeros and ones, meaning that there are certain truth propositions and that everything, if the equation adds up, so then I'm living and otherwise I'm not. Yeah, that could be soulless and completely lifeless and boring. For me, the questions began perhaps more in terms of trying to come to terms with my own existential reality. In other words, how I felt as a person with Yiddishkeit. So we talked about Tanya before. The Tanya, like invalidating the humanistic enterprise, at least the way I felt, as a way where I felt that I was incompatible with Judaism. But I think there is also room for objective questions. What I mean by that is there are certain people that would have you believe that if you are asking an intellectual question, it is only because your Yetzer Hara is looking for a rationalization. In other words, we need to give him more kugel and a little bit more love, and if we give them more kugel and more love, then all the answers will be resolved. I think that is
patronizing.
It's patronizing. I think it's intellectually dishonest, and I think it's insulting the person's intelligence. There are objective questions out there. I have been tormented by the existence, finding out that these questions do exist, and I don't have any real way of reconciling them with the hashkafa that I was taught, and it's something that I live with every day, where you're trying to be a committed Jew, and yet you feel like there's something like nishtahi nishtaher. Like I feel there's a certain truth that I was taught that I can no longer accept because intellectually it doesn't add up, and yet I still want to live the life of a committed Jew. I want to feel meaning living a committed Jew, but yet the commitment does suffer somewhat when you're lacking that conviction, the way a Pinya Korf or another great Chassidic role model or Rav or Mashpia has a Munah Shlema. You say they're living with their truth and they have no problem with it. But so I definitely do feel that there is a distinction that should be made between the personal dimension, which is, like you mentioned, do I find my place within Yiddishkeit? I think it can be summed up. Many people, I think there are more people dealing with that issue. Do I have a place in Yiddishkeit? Not whether or not Yiddishkeit is true. Their question is more, do I have a place in Yiddishkeit? Then there are other questions that because of that, and I think many times what happens is, because you question whether you fit in with Yiddishkeit, the subjective questions lead to objective questions. Who says that is true? I know for me personally, when I started, my burgeoning sexuality and masturbation, so at a certain point I started questioning, should I take what the Gemara says about masturbation literally? In other words, if I take it literally, then I had problems reconciling my feelings, what I felt was healthy with what the Gemara says. And I felt an intellectual question, like either I need to re-understand what Chazal is saying, or this is something which is very, very bizarre, like on an intellectual level to accept. It sounded too crazy. Or certain questions like certain Agadas Chazal, which seem very, very bizarre, or scientific, age of the universe, scholarly or historical scholarship into the origins of Judaism, all those issues. These are legitimate questions that need to be dealt with. And I feel there are people that are more bothered by the first question, and then there are other people that are more bothered by the emotional issues. There are people that are more bothered by the secondary issues. I feel for me the emotional questions led up to the intellectual questions, but I feel that the intellectual questions have problematized my position a lot more than the emotional questions. Were it only for the emotional questions, if I would grow up, or if I would be able to treat myself to a more compassionate and embracing, a more positive view of Yiddishkeit, then I would be able to resolve a lot of the tension. But the intellectual questions still remain. The knowledge, facts don't go away. You can't tell somebody to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. You just can't. So today, without going into details, I find that at least certain areas of Haredi hashkafa that I was brought up with, or Haredi belief system that I was brought up with, I find it very, very hard to accept, and therefore it raises all kinds of issues. But this is a very, very personal confession. Now, finally, I guess we'll close with this. Is my interest in Yiddish literature in general, and Chaim specifically. It's actually interesting because, again, I'm packing in a whole lecture in 5 minutes, but I'll just go for it. I guess it's like a weird thing that we're just coming from this kumzitz, and we just bumped into you, and you decided to fire me or question me or interview me. Anyway, from my experience in university, in the academic Jewish, the academic field of Yiddish today, I would basically say that there are 3 types of people that are interested in Yiddish. This is not a professional assessment. This is just a from-the-field observation. They basically can be categorized into 3 categories. And I'm not talking about native Yiddish speakers, obviously. I'm talking about people that come to Yiddish later in life. One would be people whose parents or grandparents spoke Yiddish. Basically, they want to connect to Yiddish because I have roots in Yiddish, or nostalgia, memory, Holocaust, shtetl, and all that. A way of reconnecting to their Jewishness, a way of connecting to an aspect of their Jewish identity or Jewish culture, which has been part of their heritage, might have been muted for a very long time. Second category of people are people who are researching Jewish history or Jewish life, and have an interest in Jewish culture for whatever reason. It could also be for issue number 1, because they were raised Jewish or have Jewish in the family, they want to reconnect with their Jewishness. But here we're talking about objective researchers, also many non-Jews. Somebody, for example, people that are studying Jewish-Polish relations, and in order for them to understand the nature of those relations, they need to contact the primary source material in Yiddish. So that would be the second category of people. People are using it for academic purposes, historical research and similar undertakings. The third category of people are people that use Yiddish as a way of empowering their marginal status. So there are many people today who use Yiddish as a form of minority culture, minority affiliation, whether that would be in terms of politics. Certainly be extreme left-wing anarchism, for example, anarchists or libertarianism, or people, let's say even people that I know that are anti-Zionist. So they don't want to connect with Hebrew because they see it as some kind of right-wing thing. So Yiddish is like the minority culture, the underdog culture. There are a lot of people in a queer space that are interested in Yiddish, which I found very, very interesting. Like, what does Yiddish have to do with the whole LGBTQ scene? But yet it does, because many people are hanging on to Yiddish as a kind of alternative form of identity. Right. Like kind of the minority language, the underdog, the suppressed, attacked. And that's very much how these people feel, that they're their alternative expression of identity, which they want affirmation, and Yiddish, among all other kinds of minority or marginal or peripheral forms of cultural expression, find their way to this whole thing. So for me, I was wondering, like, why am I interested in Yiddish? Well, first of all, Yiddish happens to be my first language, and I really did, as a kid, up until a certain age, my dominant language was Yiddish anyway. And my first reading language and language of literacy was Yiddish, writing in Yiddish, reading in Yiddish, and so forth. So for me, it's not a question of how I got involved in Yiddish. I really was exposed to Yiddish from age 0. But why did I revisit it? And here's an interesting thing. So I thought about it, and I said, where do I fit on those 3 different things? Well, first of all, all of the above, because I do have an interest in Yiddish as my identity, as a culture and religion and all that. I also am researching historical, I'm doing historical research of Yiddish, the life of Eastern Europe and all that. And finally, and this is the crucial epiphany for me, I realized that Yiddish plays a very, very interesting role in my own broadening Jewish identity as a kind of cultural mediator between Judaism as a religion and Judaism as what Mordechai Kaplan calls, although he was known as an epicurus, whatever, but he has some interesting ideas, Judaism as a civilization, or Judaism as an all-encompassing culture. Yiddish, and I want to break it apart even more, because I was basically, I'm trilingual, so I grew up with English, with Yiddish, and also with Hebrew, at least initially in Lashon Kodesh, biblical Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew, as opposed to modern Hebrew. And later on, obviously, I speak modern Hebrew fluently. I've been living in Israel for the past 13 years, and I'm fluent in Hebrew, modern Hebrew as well. But for me, basically, Lashon Kodesh, growing up, was exclusively a religious language. So that would, if I want to express my religious identity, that would be in Lashon Kodesh. If I want to express my general identity as a human being, it would be in English, which is an international language. But if I want to find an expression of my Jewishness, which is more encompassing than just religion, it doesn't negate religion, but is more encompassing than just religion, then for me it would be Yiddish. Because Yiddish is that cultural mediator, that cultural bridge that is able, on the one hand, I can express the profoundest ideas of Hasidus in Yiddish, but I can also read secular Yiddish poetry or Yiddish plays in Yiddish. So Yiddish for me is a kind of bridge between my more religious interests, which in terms of language would be strictly Lashon HaKodesh, and my strictly secular interests, which don't necessarily have to be Jewish, my aesthetic interest in literature and art and music, which doesn't necessarily belong only to the Jewish realm. But I want to find a way of expanding my Jewishness to do all of these and include them in some kind of broader Jewish self-definition. And that's what Yiddish does for me. And then here's where Chaim Grade comes in. Chaim Grade, just to give a very, very 5-minute bare bones thumbnail sketch of Chaim Grade. Chaim Grade was born in 1910 and he died in 1982. He was born in Vilna. He was actually an orphan at a young age. His mother, who sold fruits and vegetables, raised him. And he lived after the Yatke Vergas on the street of all the butchers. And he was kind of a worldly street guy, even thug to a certain degree. That's at least what I gathered from his literary documents. At a certain point, he was enticed or convinced to join a very, very strict Musar yeshiva, known as the Navaradok Musarnikis, which was the most extreme form of Musar. Like, one of the things they say about them, for example, is that in order to teach them sheer disregard for public opinion, they were encouraged to go into a pharmacy and ask for nails. Or you walk around the street and ask some non-Jews what parsha it is. Like, knowing that they would look at them as complete mishigoyim, like, what do they know about the parsha? At some point, he was, or even from the beginning, he probably wasn't interested in it. And then the great Chazon Ish of Avram Yishayahu Karelitz, who was a great Gaon and great Talmud Chacham, a Litvische Gaon and Talmud Chacham, took him under his wing. He wanted to be Makar of him a bit, and he learned with him for 7 years. Until 1932-33, when he went to Israel. And then Chaim Grade left traditional observance. He went fry in our parlance.
In Israel, not in...
No, he stayed in Vilna. He remained in Vilna. When the Chazon Ish, when his Rebbe went to Israel, so he made his final break with... he started reading secular Yiddish literature before, and he was involved with Jung Vilna, and he published poetry, but I think even then he probably published a little poetry, although I'm not sure. But his decisive break was later.
That the play The Quarrel, is that autobiographical?
The play The Quarrel is autobiographical, but let me just tell your audience, whoever might be eavesdropping, a little bit more about it. So actually, Chaim Grade wrote a short story or novella called Mein Krieg mit Herrscher Seiner, My Quarrel with Herrscher Seiner. It was originally published in Yiddish in the magazine called Yiddish Kämpfer, and it was later on translated into English and then even made into a movie, although they didn't really do justice to the original Yiddish story. They changed it a lot. And that is autobiographical. as far as we can tell. And one of the great, and here let me just launch in a little bit more and fill in the gaps with Chaim rather. So he remained in Vilna. He became secular. At the outbreak of the war, he moved to Vilna. Whatever he studied, he moved to moved to Vilna. He was in Vilna, and then ultimately he fled to deep Russia, like Kazakhstan, or the Asian part of Russia. I'm not exactly sure where he was, but like a lot of Lubavitchers went to Samarkand, deep Russia, and then he ended up in Paris, and then he came to New York in 1948, and that's where he lived for the rest of his life until 1982. He wrote many poems, like 10 books of poetry, and he also wrote on and off, but for the most part regularly, a weekly serialized novel or story within the Yiddish press. And some of the books that he's most famous for example, the Yeshiva or Tzemach Atlas in Yiddish, or the Aguna, my mother's Sabbath Day, the Mamre Shabbosim, my mother's Tzavot, my mother's Last Will and Testament, and among other books and stories. The Shtumer Minyan, the Klois and the Gas. If I'm not quoting them correctly, you can look them up on Wikipedia or Amazon or National Yiddish Book Center and upload his books. Anyway, the reason why I find him interesting, to make a long story short, is because here is an example of, first of all, one of the most talented novelists in the post-Holocaust period, who wrote real literature, not Haredi propaganda. Sorry for the indictment. This is not Haredi didactic literature, which is a better word than propaganda. It isn't just about the message of be a good Jew. It is describing what really went on with great literary art. It has literary merit. It explains a human drama as opposed to a certain philosophical truth that kind of uses humans as a way to impart it. And he deals with the yeshiva life which is most familiar to me as somebody growing up in yeshiva, although in a very different yeshiva atmosphere. He also discusses the life of rabbis, the life of Gedolei Yisrael, the Chafetz Chaim, Reb Chaim Oizer. It was Litvish. I grew up Chassidic, so there is that kind of there is that. I think sometimes we want to not be too close to home. If there were novelists writing about Lubavitch, maybe that would be too intense for me at this moment. Like, I'm not writing right now about Fischl Schneerson, although I do want to write. But I feel at the beginning I just want to explore a more distant one where I can be more objective about, and yet one where both the author and the subject matter is in my own way relevant, because I feel Chaim Grad in his own life does explore the tensions between religion, modernity, and secularity. For example, just to finish off the final few minutes, Mein Krieg Mutersha Seiner is a very good example. I remember like almost 20 years ago, I watched it when I was in Australia, the film version of it. And one of my relatives observed me watching the video and said, "Barry, you were actually crying when you were watching the film." And the reason why it was so engrossing, this is before I even read the Yiddish or even English of it, was because the protagonist in the play, Hersha Seiner and Heikel Wilner, one religious, one secular, they both confront issues of faith and Jewish identity after the Holocaust in a very gut-wrenching way, in which religious or any kind of platitudes, secular platitudes, cannot do justice to the enormity of the tragedy. I think one of the problems with standard, conventional religious upbringing is that sometimes they offer platitudes and shallow sound bites which don't do justice to the complexity and paradoxical nature of human experience. One line from whatever great religious book might be cannot capture the multidimensionality of human conflict. You have a whole Sefer Eov dealing with human pain and suffering, and theodicy, the justification of God in light of suffering. There's not one line that you can answer all these questions, and there are still answers that remain open. So even that ability to explore in an open-ended way two sides of the coin, something which is not afforded in the traditional chinuch system, where before you even open up your mouth to ask the question, you already have a stock footage answer. For me, that is, I guess, why I'm exploring a guy like Chaim, rather, because he was on both sides of the fence. He dealt with both issues in his own way, and I also deal with questions from both sides of the fence and how I'm able to address them. And my choice in life is very different. Rather left observance, I'm still a committed, observant Jew, religious Jew. But nevertheless, I feel the questions cannot be ignored. Living a religious life is not one in which you can take comfort and say, I have all the answers already. No, it's one which makes you ask more questions. I think that's also what the Kusker tells you, that being religious is about struggling with God. The reason why we're called Yisrael is ki kisarisa im elikim va'anosh, although there it doesn't necessarily mean God, but it means a ministering angel. But I think being Yisrael means that we wrestle with God. Profound questions of faith, profound, unsettling questions about the nature of existence, and that is how I see my Judaism. I guess that's pretty much where I stand with Chaim Grab. And it's also it's great literature, but it also is connected with Jewish thought. And I think the experience that somebody like me, who also is able to be on both sides of the fence, like Tansna Beida Chasnas, many people don't like it. Many people feel that you're either Oder Dahin, Oder Daher. But I think that life is more complex. There isn't always just one-sided view that can deal with all of reality. Sometimes there is a multi-layered, nuanced position which includes both elements of a religious approach and also maybe religious humanism, or a more secular approach, or a more secular meaning more humane, human, shared human experience on a human level, not just always invoking God and the Torah, and not ultimately. I think that a broader vision of God and the Torah does address the broader issues of humanity, but that's a much more expansive vision of Torah and humanity than the one that I was taught with, which I think has a more narrow vistas of what, or a more narrow way of dealing with these conflicts. A lot of it is just by cutting off a lot of things that don't fit in. And I don't think that can really, you cannot address issues by just ignoring them, or just by stifling them, or by destroying them. We can't be a Rashbi that if I don't like what you're doing, your form of behavior, I move out of the grave and I just burn everything down. No, we need to build things up. We need to find an expansive Judaism, which instead of saying, nor mitar nicht, you need to say, yes, we can. Sorry for paraphrasing the Obama cliche, but an affirming Judaism, not a negating Judaism. And it will challenge, I think the younger generation will challenge Rabbanim and Mashpiyim to come up with a much more robust and open-minded Judaism, which is not afraid of contemporary challenges. I think it's a pity that in all other areas we're making progress, but when it comes to Judaism, all of a sudden we say we need to go back. Like I often joke that what is the greatness of from technology, that we can circumvent technological advances. So if there is electronic keys that are used today in hotels, we need to find ways of disabling them so we can still use the old technology on Shabbos. I mean, with all the beauty of it, I don't want Judaism to be an Amish bubble. Mm-hmm. I want it to be one which can fully embrace reality. So there are ways. I'm not saying that therefore we need to embrace everything. There are certain things that are very damaging in the modern world. But at least that we can talk about them. At least that we can confront them head on. Anyway, I know I've given you a lot. I've probably given you a lot more than you bargained for, but
really good stuff. But what I always find ironic is, however it may play out on a practical level, electronic keys or manual old keys, right? So there's always going to be details how things are worked out, la halacha. But in terms of what our preference should be, al pi chassidus, is to always find a place where spirituality is not at odds with reality in the world. Mm-hmm. Because our belief is that it's all einun levad. So therefore, the fact that I'm experiencing as opposites is nothing more than my own perception. With that belief, I'm always going to be looking for inroads to how they really are at one with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It to me, that's like Aleph Beis of Chassidus, Baal Shem Tov. It's like, and yet so often we hear things which is the exact opposite, that we're starting from a place of that they are absolutely at odds, and here and there, Nebuch, we don't have any other options, so we have to settle for, Nebuch, B'shas HaTchak, if it's Sakanos Nefashis, so then you engage with the world because Nebuch, you don't have an alternative, because we don't, we only make kugel, we don't make medicine, so we have to go there. It's like this, complete...
Great luck.
So,
Great luck, yeah.
So, it was a Rav in Crown Heights who published this, where someone quoted him and published the whole thing, and it was about Nebuch, how dear they invite an outside person to teach Lubavitchers how to be mechanech children. You're bringing in a guide, tells it, just giving simple, practical modalities for teaching children. And the example he gave was like, Hayatach, and we're going to the outside when we have it internally. And he gave the example of how Shalom Aleichem changed the story of the child going into Shalom Yom Kippur, the shepherd boy singing Kukoriku, and kind of folklorized it and took it from a Chassidic Maisa. Maybe it was the other way around, for all I know, it doesn't really make a difference. But he was maybe lamenting how someone was quoting that story from Shalom Aleichem and not attributing it to Chassidic Maisa. Regardless of what exactly it was, when I read that, I was like, doesn't this whole thing miss the point? In that the whole beauty of that story is its humanity, and whether it's about, whether it's a Chassidic Maisa or a folk tale, this sense of at war with, as if they're two separate things, is so, to me, antithetical to what Chassidus is. It's supposed to be not building bridges, because that would kind of imply that they are separate, but to find ways to break our misperception of them being opposites altogether.
Here I would want to react briefly again. I think I need to maybe go back a little bit and qualify my previous statement and recognize the other point of view. And I feel there's this great tension in life, not only in religion or not only in Judaism, between what I referred to before as the all-inclusive approach versus the all-exclusive approach. I see it as a manifestation of chesed and gvura, the difference in chesed and gvura, where chesed is love to all without any boundaries or without any reservation, without making any distinctions between people, and gvura is like an all-exclusive meritocracy. You're only going to get if you deserve, and distinctions between hierarchies and distinctions between people. I think that within Judaism today, perhaps more than in a long time, or more than ever perhaps, we really experience that tension between the forces of those that preach a chesed-based Judaism, where we want to include everything under Judaism, where we want to turn, let's say, Judaism into liberal tikkun olam, feel good about yourself, life-affirming, self-help, bliss Judaism, and a very strict spiritual discipline Judaism, where you need to really earn your stripes, and you need to really be part of a deep spiritual discipline in order to be holy. And just to talk about the other side, I think there is a side in Judaism which is about Havdalah, where we are actually Mitzvah Shabbos. Havdalah, there is Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'Choil, there is a distinction between the holy and the profane. There is a distinction between a Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. There is a distinction between things that are spiritual and things that are mundane. And I think there is very much that focus within certain people who emphasize one more than the other. Some people want to focus more on the Avos Yisrael. There is no conflict between spirituality and divinity, and reality and the world. And then there's another thrust which is saying, wait one second. we need to make a kedoshim tiyu. We need to be holy. We need to be separated. Have prushim in arayas, be separated from, the meaning of the pasuk is be separated, distance yourself from illicit sexual relationships. But in the broader context, it means that even we need to be separated from the mundane ways of the world. So I think that fight between...
But that's not the end in itself. That is a necessity. You could say maybe, Kedoshim Tiyu, why? Just to stay that way? No, because in order to be a Ar Lagayim, you have to first be separate and for yourself, right? I mean, to say just the separation, it's fundamental, but it's not an end in itself, is it?
Well, I think we can argue about it. We can debate whether or not ultimately Judaism, religion, the ultimate goal is about all inclusiveness or all exclusiveness. In other words, is the ultimate vision that Judaism is brought down to the lowest depths, or that we're able to elevate everything in the world to the highest level? But I definitely do see in contemporary Judaism that spanning the divide between both ways of, on the one hand, wanting an approach of Judaism which is more, even to joke around about the contemporary shul, the demographics in Crown Heights in terms of the shul. So there's a joke that I once said, there's called Chevra Avos Yisrael, which is known to be much more welcoming, and some people will say too much, too welcoming, too compromising, and strict Chassidic standards of, even if it isn't halachically problematic. And then there's another shul, which I heard, I never went there, it's called Tzadikim Shul, with the holy people. And actually in the Lubavitch, at least in the Lubavitch Nusach of davening, the beginning of davening is Hareini Mekabel Alai, Mrs. Asher Shavavta L'Recha Komecha, Mrs. Avos Yisrael. The last part of davening is that Ach Tzadikim Edu L'Shmach Yeshu Yishar Maspanecha, talking about the people, the exclusively righteous club. So I once joked that between the embracing all Jews lovers of Israel club and the exclusively righteous club, from A to Z, we need to find some kind of happy medium. And this is also where I myself feel torn, because on the one hand, like I mentioned before about Lubavitch Light and Lubavitch Zero, there is one instinct or impulse in me which says, why shouldn't Lubavitch why can't everybody say that I want to be part of Lubavitch? Why do I need to kick somebody out? Why do I need to judge somebody and say, you're not Lubavitch because you don't live up to the standards of Lubavitch Chassidus? So there is an impulse in me as a person who's a very open-hearted person. I want to embrace everybody. But on the other hand, we have to realize that all kinds of disciplines have their breaking point. And that's more maybe my more Zirkind upbringing, which is that other voice in me, which is saying that im ein das Havdalah minayin, there is kedusha, there is Havdalah, there is separation, there is a hierarchy. Not everything can be holy. Not everything is on the same level. You cannot somebody who's living a life of asceticism, or somebody who goes in the mikveh every day and he's careful in lashon hara and kedusha and tznius and all that, cannot be on the same level as somebody who indulges in all the pleasures of the world and be considered completely holy on the same level. I mean, in a certain sense, that was Korach's argument. That was the liberal argument. Kol ha'eda kulam kedoshim. Yes, on a certain basic level, every Jew is holy, whether or not he observes the mitzvahs or not. But on another level, the manifestation of kedusha. So I am not the person to say that we should completely obliterate or completely mute or silence the voices that are agitating or pushing for a higher level of sanctity in the community. I think there's a healthy dialectic going on, especially in the Crown Heights community, between those forces that are interested in purifying the camp, Taras Amachana, and those that are saying that we need to include a broader segment of society to feel Tachas Kanfei Hashchina. You're always going to find that dialectic within Judaism. I think it's a healthy one. How do we negotiate it exactly is a question. What I don't want to see is that where one of them completely trumps the other and there's no room for discussion anymore. In my own life, I also feel that there's my own desire, like I said, to be a free bird. But on the other hand, I want to feel rooted. The only way I can feel rooted is if I cut myself off. By being rooted means that by de facto I am not involved in all these other manifestations. I need to be focused in one area.
Yeah, the roots and the wings.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about the dialectic. There's, I think Tevye put it best, in Fiddler on the Roof.
On the one hand, on the other hand, what?
Not that part, but he said, a bird can love a fish, but where would they build a home? Yeah.
Talking about Yiddish literature, just on an aside, it's just curious that people don't understand really what Tevye is all about because this has been really lost in translation. By the way, there's a 1939 movie.
I have the movie here.
Yeah,
Tevye
the Milchiker in Yiddish.
That's the Morris Schwartz.
Yeah, which is a lot more authentic. And actually what Shalom Aleichem does is a brilliant ploy where basically what he does is, in literature there's that notion of the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
Where somebody feels that he's telling the truth, but we know better, and we know that maybe that person's intelligence is limited. So in the same way, in the same vein, a similar vein, this is my view, Shalom Aleichem is taking the character of Tevye, is creating a character Tevye, who he thinks that he's learned.
Right.
But we, behind his back, because we know better, we realize this is how he botches up. So for example, I think the first statement of Tevye, the good book, what he does is there's inevitably always a quotation from Lashon Kodesh and a mistranslation in Yiddish. Now that mistranslation can sometimes even be a good witticism, which actually is insightful, and sometimes is a complete botching and butchering of the original Hebrew. So one of them, which is less problematic and is quite witty, but yet not a faithful translation, is one of where it says Adam yisoidei ma'afer v'soifei la'afer, and he touches up as a mensch starker wie Eisen und schwacher wie a Flieg. So in the Hebrew, it means that a person's foundation, a person comes from dust and he will return to dust. So it means talking about how a person is insignificant. Adam yisoidei ma'afer v'soifei la'afer. So in Tevye's wisecrack translation, where he thinks he's being very smart, but he is not faithfully translating the Hebrew, is that a person is stronger than iron and weaker than a fly. But this is just the beginning. And it's interesting that when Shalom Aleichem is translated into different languages, they need to find a way of playing that. So he had a son-in-law called Yehudah DovBer Zirkind, who was a great writer in his own right. And what he does is that
Shalom Aleichem's
his son-in-law. So when he translated Tuvia Cholev, I think he did, Tuvia Cholev, they're different, Chalban, Cholev. So what he does, because he's writing only in Hebrew, Shalom Aleichem can quote the Hebrew and then he translates in Yiddish. But what happens if you're only writing in Hebrew? So in order to translate it, he either will take Pirush Rashi, like Rashi explains it and then botch it up, or he'll say V'targum Unkelos, V'tirgem Unkelos, give like an Aramaic paraphrases it in Aramaic, and sometimes he botches it up that way. But he was quite brilliant, Berkovich, in doing it in the other languages. It is just an aside. You're saying that one of the problems is, I think, talking about the Kedusha versus inclusivity, I think or inclusivity in terms of also affirming artistic interests and at the same time living with the mandate of Kedusha. It's very easy if you go one way or the other. It's very easy to say somebody have art and artistic talent, suppress it, and don't use it at all, or tell somebody you have free license, free reign, do whatever you want, and don't let go of all restrictions. There's a vart of the Pshischa, or attributed to Pshischa, I think it's very, very profound, very simple one of Pshischa, which is that a person has to hold two different messages in his pockets. One is that B'shvili Nivra Olam, that the world was created for my sake. The other one is V'anoichi Ofer Be'efer, that I'm merely dust and ashes. I think there is great wisdom in it because it basically tells us that, first of all, there's a great human insight into the paradoxical nature of people, like we mentioned before. I mentioned Schwacher wie Eisen and Starker wie Eisen and Schwacher wie a Flieg. So too, on the one hand, you got to know that the world was created for my sake, to feel that the world is my oyster and the world was created just for me. On the other hand, to realize that you're just a piece of dust. But I find that one of the problems with thinking in general, most people's puny minds, is the inability to entertain paradoxical thinking, contradictory thinking, Most people are not capable of living simultaneously with two contradictory or paradoxical thoughts. Most people want either to believe that B'Shvili Nivra Olam or V'Anochi Afer Ve'efer. To have both together is very, very difficult. And that's why I also say that being able to juggle, on the one hand, that desire, that impulse towards inclusivity within Judaism, and at the same time a sense of kedusha and separation, is very hard. It's much easier to advocate for one as opposed to the other.
Yeah, I think that, we're naturally we are built with we have the innate ability to it's fun to experience and live with paradoxes. Either they will be healthy ones or not. Meaning the holding at the same time in one pocket B'Shvili Nivra Olam, and in the other I'm just dust and ashes. Right? The inverse of that, if I can't appreciate because each of those are beautiful, right? B'Shvili Nivra Olam, and it's not I'm a piece of garbage. It's ultimately I am not irrelevant. I'm part of the spirit of nothingness that is all of reality. Not any more, any less than anyone else. Just we're all dust and ashes, right? And at the same time, the world is my oyster, like you said. But what that isn't is that I'm greater than or worse than.
Very interesting.
And what I realized was
beautiful.
I do not embrace that paradox from a healthy place, I will end up vacillating in the paradox in an unhealthy sense, which says on the one hand, when I'm living in the confines of my own mind, somehow I'm greater than everyone else, which is a falsehood. Or I'm beneath everyone else, which is just another falsehood.
Beautiful.
Whereas the other ones are completely, but they're very different than each other.
Oh, it's beautiful what you just said. Because you're right, in the sense, what you're saying is that I'm no better or less, ultimately, meaning as a human being, there's an equalizing. On the one hand, we're all B'Shvili Nivra Olam, and we're all Afer Ve'efer.
And everyone can do that without it being a conflict.
Yeah, we both belong to the stars, and we're also dust. I think it was Carl Sagan who said it. Somebody said it, that we're all stardust. Yeah, so that really...
Dust in the wind...
Yeah, we spoke about it a lot. There's a lot to talk about. I in my own life try to embody that paradoxical thinking. Also, like I said before, the roots and the wings, and living in that difficult juggling act of being true to myself or my more autonomous self, at the same time not relinquishing my connection to family, community, tradition, and all that. And also trying to go on an unmitigated, uncensored quest for truth, and not feel that I need to surrender my intellectual integrity because Haredi Hashkafa demands otherwise, for example. Yet at the same time appreciating the wisdom within the tradition that I grew up with. And I think I'm coming to a place where I'm able to integrate a lot more than I used to. I think that is also a sign of maturity, that it isn't either one or the other, but they're both and. Some people won't like it because they feel it's either or, other God or the garnish. Truth means the Havdalah, like I said. There is no room for including multiple approaches. But I am past that point. I am past what I call fundamentalist Judaism. My connection with Yiddishkeit is not a fundamentalist one. It is not based on a fundamentalist, doctrinally dogmatic point of view. It is very much based on my deep love and admiration and appreciation for the religious and spiritual value of Judaism and my identification as a Jew. I also realize that ultimately the relationship between me and God and my Judaism and my family and life is more important than upholding a specific doctrine or a specific view of life. Ultimately, feeling that you are feeling alive, like you mentioned before, feeling that deep connection to reality is much more satisfying than just being able to defend a slogan. I feel people that need to wave flags or shout slogans are infantile, in my opinion. Maybe I'm being very judgmental or patronizing or snobby, but yes, on a certain level, it can help.
Screams of insecurity.
Yiddishkeit is greater than just parading one slogan, a catechism, a dogma. This is the way it must be. This is the only way, and we must preserve. I mean, like I said, I don't want Amish Judaism. If all that Judaism has to offer to today's seeking mind is an Amish version, where we disconnect from all of... Yes, there is a day of Shabbos. I agree. That's why I said before that there's a balancing the Choil and the Kodesh. Definitely. But a view of Judaism in which we bury our hands in sand. And also, quite frankly, I'm deeply distressed that when it comes to the more intellectual questions, people within the community are absolutely incapable of addressing them. Yes, they were raised by Kedusha V'Tara. They were raised by Amunah Tamima. But on the other hand, people that are inquisitive and that are curious and are well-read, when they confront their rebbes with information which doesn't fit into their hashkafic system, they're absolutely incapable of dealing with them, which makes them inevitably lose respect for them. Mm-hmm. Which means inevitably, so I say, okay, this person might be a Chassidish Yid, may be a very, very holy Jew, but the only reason he could be that holy Jew is because he lives in an intellectual ghetto. The minute he becomes an intellectual or cosmopolitan, then he is not capable of tackling, of living on that level of holiness. Which for me will set up an impossible dilemma, because if you live in an intellectual ghetto and you're not exposed to the broader world, so fine. You don't know the broader realities that exist out there. But when you are exposed to them, and you realize that on account of that, it just doesn't add up anymore. It just doesn't add up. The 2 plus 2 it cannot be 5. The ghetto way of thinking of it just doesn't work. Then you're really in a difficult position. And there are plenty of people out there which are in a similar position, and yet they're afraid of coming out because lest they be branded Meshuggah or an epikairos or a persona non grata within the community. And I think it's really a shame because these issues need to be addressed. They won't go away. I don't necessarily feel it's imperative for us to teach every question to every person. I think there are certain specialized information that doesn't need to be taught to everybody. You don't need to tell every little child about all the evil in the world, or about every catastrophe or every criminal out there. You need to protect it. There has to be a scaffolding. There has to be age-appropriate stuff. Yet I guess for me, that kind of sheltered education with my inquisitiveness just didn't work well. The minute I realized that my rebbes it wasn't that they had a conspiracy to hide, I just feel they just didn't know. Like there are stock footage. I mean, even take things that I consider today trivial, although for certain people they're not trivial. Let's say the age of the universe. I consider it trivial because there are many Orthodox thinkers that felt it was totally compatible with Orthodox Judaism to believe that the world is millions or billions of years old and still be religious. So, for example, even this week, Alan Brill in his Kavanah Press, in his blog, actually posted a chapter of a handbook for Jewish thought that was authored by the incomparable Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, Alav Shalom, in which he basically tries to reconcile Judaism with evolution, however he understands it. But he did also translate a Jerush Or HaChaim by the Tiferes Yisrael, the commentary of the Mishnah, who does believe, based on certain words in the Medrash, that God created worlds and then destroyed them, that they might refer to the I guess prehistoric fossil ages. I mean, not prehistoric from a contemporary scientific point of view, but prehistoric in terms of the Jewish calendar. Meaning that before Tov, the beginning, year Aleph, there was a whole prehistory of where there were dinosaurs and everything else. Before the Mabul, perhaps, or whenever it might have been. But anyway, the point is that even on such an issue, we I think as a community in Lubavitch, in the frum world, we have like we have our kind of panacea, easy platitudes and answer. Well, whatever it is, we know better. What do these people really know? This is all conjecture, like dismissing science, and then when you study actually the information out there, again, science is not God. Science is not Teras Emes. Science is not necessarily 100% true. Science works by hypotheses. Science is experimental. Scientific theories can always be disproven. I'm not saying that science is always right. I'm not into a dogma of science. But like somebody once told me, he said a very wise statement, like somebody wanted a Chassidic Yid wanted to know who Isaac Newton was. Somebody told them Newton is not a Rebbe. Well, they have a different conception. A scientist is not a Rebbe. A scientist is not infallible, or is not holy. A scientist is somebody who uses his mind, it might be a brilliant mind, to try to arrive at the truth of trying to figure out what goes on. So the method of scientific inquiry is underappreciated within frum circles. And at a certain point, there is a breach of trust when a person reaches a stage where his questions are not being answered, or when he feels that he's being belittled or ridiculed for those questions. But I think beyond that, I'm for the most part beyond that. It is more the troubling aspects of when you are taught a certain way, a certain derech when you're younger. And then at a certain point, you say, wait, everything just crashes on you. Wait, this is totally... So...
I remember,
yeah.
I'm sure a large part of that, the onus is, like you're saying, on the people in those positions who have not reconciled that for themselves and are living in an intellectual ghetto, and they just simply don't have the resources to be able to, dialogue or deal with the questions. But I remember this one experience in Yeshiva. It was a Chassidic shir in the morning, and the Maggid shir, the Mashpia, was he's practical and real guy.
Mm-hmm.
In Yiddish, he was giving the shir, and it was one of the Rebbe's Maimarim, and kind of exploring like a philosophical concept, and he was, asking in a few different ways, and he kind of posed the question to the class. And I remember kind of a bunch of clueless faces, and then one guy was just like, kept going, yeah, but we believe in the state. And the guy teaching the class got so frustrated, and he's a very, very sincere and frum Chassidic guy, like beyond. But he goes, he was Israeli, he goes, okay, stop telling me what you believe. I'm asking you what makes sense. And he kind of like get frustrated. Then he's like, okay, maybe that was a little harsh. And then everyone was like, and because he broke away from, he was just like, come on, just add it up. It doesn't make sense. And they were kind of lost. So was I. It was like, well, what do you do there, right? You've just entered a different realm where now it really has to make sense, right? 2 + 2 actually cannot equate 5 just because you believe it or because it says it.
Yeah, well...
And what I mean with that example is that to some degree it's on us because how many of us simply prefer to bank on the state instead of, finding out for ourselves, is it really so? Does it really make sense? The masses, are asses, and I'm an ass as well, but ultimately people want, just tell me what works, tell me, not what works for me, but just tell me what to do, tell me was state, and I prefer not to have to figure if it all adds up or not, And when you're selling to the masses, you go by the masses, and we have, you have to continue, and on this thing goes.
But what I would want to mention here in this connection, I think what you said was brilliant and absolutely correct. But my sister once told me that that those that leave Judaism, religion, in our context, Yiddishkeit, Frumkeit, are either those that are below average or above average. And here is where I want to, encourage or challenge or raise the issue with educators. If anybody might be listening to this in the future, or even just among ourselves right now, just sharing some ideas. A lot of work is done with the below average population. A lot of work is done with the kids that are dropouts, kids that come from emotionally, socioeconomically difficult homes, people that suffer with addictions, people that have learning disabilities and have problems fitting in. There's a lot of work and a lot of resources being directed in that direction. However, not enough is being done for those that are above average. Not enough is being done for those people who grew up in the Chassidic Orthodox community and might be gifted. They might be more curious. They might be more inquisitive. They might be more intellectually inclined, more artistically inclined, and there isn't in the same way enough resources which are spent on them. Now, I do feel, like you said before, the masses are asses, and we do need to preach a way which is good for the mainstream. I mean, even the Rambam in Moed Nevuchim talks about the Torah. He says that Torah al roiv tadaber, that Torah is prescribed for the masses, that there might be individuals who might suffer from keeping Torah mitzvahs, but Torah is geared towards the masses. I think it's true of every system in this world and the world as a whole, which is geared for the masses, for the average, for the Beinoni, in that sense that if the world would just be a mass of Yechidim, of individuals, each one going their own wild way, then there would be total anarchy. So yes, you're right. There has to be a mainstream approach. However, and this is what I struggle with, how is the Yachid supposed to deal with things? Like, for example, the Rambam wrote a sefer in his Moed Nevuchim, and he is directly addressing the individual. He said, I'd rather write a book for one intelligent individual who understands what I'm saying, rather than 1,000 or 10,000 people who won't, or something to that effect. Don't quote me on it. But I think there has to be a greater acknowledgement of the Yechidim, of individuals who are forced to trailblaze their own path, who are forced who are seekers and searchers and feel that the derech that they were taught just doesn't work for them, that they need to create their own derech. That's why I tell people, like I once joked that if I were to start a blog, everybody's writing about off the derech stories. And I said, that's boring for me, off the derech. Okay, we heard the liberation narrative, or they think is a liberation narrative off the derech. I think, why don't you start a narrative called searching for a derech, mevakshe derech, as opposed to off the derech? And I think that there is a misnomer. Many people are labeling people off the derech, and they're actually causing them to go off the derech. Whereas opposed to labeling them off the derech, why don't you relabel or orient, redescribe what you're saying to people who are searching for their own derech. In other words, sometimes people are the asses or the masses or the powers, the authority figures are so invested in defending the party line that they don't really care about the Yechidim. They'd rather maintain the integrity of the party line than really worry about the Yechidim. Now, I am at a place, talking about myself, where I'm not interested in changing the status quo per se, or the rabbin. I never can. This is the first time where I'm really talking. I don't know if it might be uploaded or posted online. This is really the first time where I'm talking openly about my own journey, more than a person that's a total stranger as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I know some of your siblings, but I'm basically letting go of a lot of pent up feelings where I am going on a Yachid journey. I am not interested in changing the derech for the masses. I'm not out there with a campaign, the smear campaign, to vilify the good and holy people of Lubavitch and to change your chinuch. I haven't gone out there with op-eds and publishing screeds about what I find problematic with the Chabad. I'm talking about from my own personal experience, and I'm talking for someone like myself. I'm not talking for most people. For most people, they need to go derech hamelech. They need to travel on the highway, and it's good for them. It works for them, and I have a profound appreciation for the well from which I drank. But together with that, I am saying that there are Yechidim who are more inquisitive, which realize that there is a lot more information out there that is not being discussed, either willingly or just because they're ignorant about it, like I said, because they live in an intellectual ghetto. And instead of working so much on defending, like you said, what you believe in, what the party line is, made me realize that there's a need for an alternative approach to a yachid. Even if you cannot sanction it from the system, but you have to realize on a practical level, like I once read an article, there's a difference between a psak and halachic counseling. Yeah, let's say it was an article about homosexuality. Somebody comes and says that I am gay. So halachically, you can tell the person, at least according to normative halacha, do whatever you want, engage in homosexual intercourse. However, you could tell the person, listen, where are you at? What can you do? Where you're holding? Or it's also take about tshuva. You cannot tell about tshuva you're allowed to eat treif, but you could counsel about tshuva to keep to start observing incrementally. There's a difference between telling them psak, usher, and mutter and counseling their own personal situation. And I also feel that if I was able to receive more guidance from my rabbonim and mashpim and from Rosh Yeshiva, although I cannot blame anyone because really I broke out on my own after I finished the system, after I was off the conveyor belt, to use that previous analogy. But I think if there is a recognition that there are questions and there aren't necessarily answers, we're living, to couch in a Chassidic language, we're living in a time of Hester Panim. There's a Helm Hester. To use Rabbi Nachman, L'kutei Moharan, Torah Samach Dalet, if I'm not mistaken, there are questions that come from the Chalal HaPanui. In other words, there are questions. Realize that in the world out there, if somebody is well-read, he's not necessarily going to come to the conclusion that the Torah is true and is self-evident, that we hold this truth to be self-evident. People are not necessarily, people that are, on the contrary, people that are more educated and more literate might question a lot more than arrive at the conclusion, which they feel is obvious, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, i.e., all of Yiddishkeit and Chassidus and Dor Hashvi and whatever else you want to add. I think just that people would realize that it isn't self-evident that what we're teaching is common sense, makes sense, given all the information. It might be very threatening to certain people because it undermines their position, but yet I think that humility would be very liberating and would be also very ennobling and would also go a long way, that especially when you're talking with Talmidim, I'm saying, okay, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. And I remember I was greatly encouraged by a rabbi, by several rabbis, who said that your questions are not crazy. They saved my Judaism because they said that your question makes sense. You're not a shagas, or you're not an epikuris for asking a question. We're not epikuris. There's room for asking questions within Judaism. There is room for struggles. And I think the same is also in terms of behavior, in terms of if somebody says, I want to be a little bit different, I want a little bit different approach. I think Lubavitch has become a lot more accepting, but I still feel, as somebody once said, it's not my word, the Lubavitch is a lot more open-hearted than open-minded. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to Hashkafa, they're not really open-minded. You go to Chabad, it's not as if they have liberal ideas. They're more accepting. Even the people in Chevra Yisrael say, some of them are more enlightened, but at a certain point, let's say take Shmuley Boteach, I'm just throwing out a wild example. At a certain point, the minute you become liberal, you push yourself away. You go beyond the breaking point. So there aren't, I don't find, within Chabad, I haven't found really open-minded rabbis. And if they are truly open-minded, they're also living in the closet, in the opposite, not intellectual ghetto, but Maranoism, where they need to suppress what they truly believe because they need to put up a show as if they buy into the party line. And there are many more educated Rabbanu Mashpiyim, or several at least, who would fit that bill. Will finally come out there and say, listen, there are issues here. We cannot just keep on preaching the party line because it just doesn't add up. And some people feel very conflicted, especially I know certain Mashpiyim that are conflicted because privately they believe X, but they need to officially teach Y. Thank God I'm not in that position. But I feel that, at least for me, I'm talking about my own journey. I don't necessarily feel this is nachlas haklal. There are more burning issues in terms of issues that affect the more general public than my intellectual meandering or my intellectual questions. But I'm still an individual. I'm still a product of the community. I still feel that deeply connected and care about the community. And I feel that nobody from the community was able to really deal with my issues. I had to go beyond the community in order to find a place. And maybe I am at a place where legitimately I move beyond the confines of the community. That could also be. Where I just hashkafically have reached a point where I no longer fit in the community, so I cannot, and that's pretty much where I am, where I just say, okay, I just cannot accept it, I cannot live based on that. But at least initially, when students are at the fence, instead of pushing them out, try as much as you can to keep them in, at least in the initial stage. When they're questioning whether or not they should stay in or walk out, maybe humility, maybe all they need is validation. All they need is saying, you know what, you can believe the world is 1 billion years and still put on old, or 15 billion years old, and still put on tefillin, and you're not an epikairos. You're not a Lubavitcher or not a good Jew for believing that. Anyway, I think we've spoken for a long time.
Was it the Rav Kook who said, why is it that someone who leaves is called Choser B'Sheila and someone who becomes frum is Choser B'Tshuva? Adarab, if you're returning to observance, that's when you have all the questions. You should be a Choser B'Sheila. I think it was attributed.
Could be. I haven't heard it, but yeah.
That's the verb, right? I mean, if you're in it, that's when you have the questions, and you're outside of it, you could just,
Just also, like, one other idea. I know we're really talking for a long time. I'm actually enjoying it, but what I would also add is another thing, less intellectual and also more being in touch with the heartbeat of the community. Something that I've noticed is that we are living in a complete sea change of an era, like the millennial era. Whereas when I was growing up, when I was still a kid, Kabbalah's oil held sway.
I don't know if we hear much of that term anymore.
Today, the young people are very empowered. They feel very, very empowered. The young people are the ones that are in control to a large extent.
I think it's a good thing. I wasn't saying
No. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but there's a major shift. Yeah. There was always deference. I grew up Kabbalah soil. We always respected our elders, and there's a value in it. Nobody would think that the young person can be their own deyazager, or a person can have their own independent opinion and be their own pundit. Whereas today, first of all, there are younger people that are making more money than their parents, just even on a socioeconomic level. And therefore, if you have money, by default, you have more power, you can do things. And also, there are young people that are not willing to go along with the Kabbalah's oil mentality. They're saying, listen, I'm artistic, I'm independent, I'm going to start my own shul, I'm going to start my own sub-movement within Lubavitch or beyond Lubavitch. And I think that in order that there shouldn't be a complete disconnect or rupture between the generations, there has to be a reevaluation of that dynamic. That the older people need to come to terms that we're not living anymore with it. That the model of Kabbalah's oil, educating children in that model, will not work anymore. It has to be more of empowerment. Even if you want to preach that adherence, and I think educators know that. I think they do know it. We live in the iPhone generation. Everything is me, iPad. It's all about personalization and less about obedience. And I think people realize it, and they're trying to do it, but yet I do feel that ultimately Lubavitch does demand bittul. There's no way of getting around it. But yet, even the sensibilities that I have, which whether, as much as I struggle with them, are still bread and butter, are still in my mother's milk, are still in my gut, for young people, even if they grow up Lubavitch, for example, it's completely foreign to them.
I remember I have a younger brother, and I was, it's the guy, let's play it in a second. So I when he was like 17, I was like, I want to help him. He shouldn't have to deal with all the neuroses and all the complications that I did. So we took him out one night, and I said, like, you should feel comfortable and don't feel like stressed by the yeshiva system. And if you want to leave, you leave. And if you have a girlfriend, go with that, and don't feel ashamed and don't. And you should be able to dress the way you want. I'm giving you the things that I took years to like feel comfortable with. And then everything I said, he's like, yeah, I know. I was like, what do you mean? You're 17. You're supposed to be rid of guilt and isolated shit. He's like, no, I know. And then I realized, like, in a short period of time, kids, got the message and they're doing their thing, and they're not, and I was like, wow, okay, great. And he's, by the way, only healthier and more committed for it. There's not a disparity of two different lives, And this has been really, really good.
This is call it Ashkacha Praktis, call it an interesting coincidence, call it a late night Farbrengen, whatever. I hope this has been of use. It's definitely been an awesome discussion for me.
And I know the song that I'm going to use for the introduction. It's got to be around 3 hours. My Kamash Malon. Yeshiva. It's a Chaim Rad the song.
Mordechai Hirschman.
Yeah, it sings it beautifully.
Yeah. Okay. Glad, hopefully, people will understand what I'm saying. Like I quoted before from Murder Nevuchim, that if one person will get something and other people won't understand, okay, I'm not talking to the mainstream. Yeah. I'm not, my points are not addressed to the mainstream. My points are addressed to kindred spirits, people like me who struggle.
I've been surprised a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in the other podcasts. I thought maybe it's going to be 4 or 5 people. But the numbers show otherwise. People stop me on the street. Baruch Hashem, there's a lot of Yechidim.
Yechidim school. Maybe we should make a community of Mevakshei Derech, finding their own authentic way to Yiddishkeit. Anyway, thank you so much, Chaim.
עלה למעלה, עלה בן אדם, עלה למעלה, עלה בן אדם, עלה למעלה, עלה למעלה, עלה בן אדם, עלה למעלה, עלה כי כוח עז לך, יש לך כנפי רוח, יש לך כנפי רוח, כנפי נשרים אבירים, אל תיקח אשבם, פן יכחשו לך, דרוש אותם, דרוש בן אדם, וימצאו לך מיד. תפגוש אותם בראש בן אדם וימצאו לך מיד